Hello, I'd like to continue with the second presentation on valuation and rates of return. In this part, I want to focus on rates of return. Now, remember what we said when we were looking at how we value bonds. And we said what we basically do is to discount or to determine the present value of the interest payments and the present value of the face value, that's the principal, using a certain discount rate. And the discount rate is the required rate of return, or what we call the yield rate. So the yield to maturity on a bond, was also known as the discount rate, is what bondholders are demanding for the investment in the bond. But keep in mind the number that we're using here, it's influenced by a number of factors. So I'm going to look at three factors that influences the yield rate, but there's more than three factors. One, of course, is the real rate of return, or what we call the risk-free rate. And that is basically the rate of return on investment, again, assuming there is no inflation. And the other factor that will influence the required rate of return will be the inflation premium. So if inflation is existing, then we adjust the required rate of return by adding the inflation premium or the inflation risk. The other component that will influence the required rate of return is going to be the risk premium, which could be as a result of the business risk or it could be a financial risk. And we're going to discuss about risk and how to measure risk in finance in our later chapters. But just here to point out is that the business risk and the financial risk will also affect the yield rate or the discount rate. So in summary, I just want to show you this, just to show you that when we're talking about the required rate of return, the R, this R is influenced by the risk-free rate, assuming there's no inflation. If there's inflation is existing, then of course we have to add in the inflation premium, and we also have to add in the default risk, and we also have to consider liquidity premium. Remember that some investment or some securities that it's not as easy if you're trying to convert them to cash, and because they're not as liquid, there will be some element of risk inherent in those securities. There is also the maturity risk. Remember, as time goes by, the longer the investment to maturity is, the longer the maturity, there is also a risk inherent in those particular securities. So, and therefore, what constitute the yield to maturity or the required rate of return on investment should then reflect all these elements depending on the nature of the security. For example, if we're looking at a short-term security, and a good example of this is the government treasury bill. A treasury bill for 3 months, you'll find it will not have the maturity risk because we're only talking about 3 months. It will not have a liquidity premium because it is easy for you to sell a treasury bill. it will not even have a default risk, because again, when it comes to government securities, there is some kind of guarantee that the government will honor those securities. So we have to look at the security itself and determine which premium or which risk is inherent in that particular security. So let me just take you here so that we can understand how we compute or how we calculate the required rate of return or the yield to maturity. So if I have to use the bond as an example, this is what we did in a part one of our discussion. Is we said in order for us to determine the present value, the price, the value of the bond, what we're going to do is to discount the interest payment at using a particular rate, which is y, and also discount the principal, that is the face value of the bond, again using a particular rate. And if you remember, we were using a 10% as a discount rate, and we also did look at 15% and also used 7%. But my point I'm trying to draw here is, how can we compute the y if y is not given to us? So because we are looking at how we can compute the required rate of return, so you're going to be given all the other values. So you'll be given the price of the bond in the market today. You're going to be given the interest payment, or you'll be given the coupon rate, and you can use the coupon rate times the face value to determine what the interest payment is. The face value will be given to you because it is indicated on the bond, and then the rest is just to plug in if you're going to use the formula to determine what that y or the R&D, as some text will show, is going to be. The other alternative will be to use even Excel, and you can use Excel to do the same thing. And what you're going to do, you're just going to insert your, for example, this is a bond, it's a 10-year bond with a coupon rate, which again is a yearly coupon rate of $1,000, and the bond is selling today for 887. So in other words, if you use the formula, what we are trying to say here is, this is the value of the bond, what the bond is selling for today. So the 887 is equal to the discount of all the interest payment plus the discount of the face value, which again in this case we know the interest payment is 9% of the face value, which is 9% of that is $90. That's why you see the 90, 90, 90. And the bond is for 10 years, so we know that our N is going to be 10, and therefore you just plug in everything that you have, and the R&D or the Y is what we're looking for. And again, if you use Excel, you'll be able to find what that I is going to be. Or you can use again the financial calculator, and that will also help you in trying to determine what that Y is. So if you use a financial calculator, you'll be able to put in your N is, again this case is 10. You'll be able to insert your rate, which in this case we don't know, so we're going to leave that blank, and we are going to insert our present value, which is for us is 887, and then we are going to insert the payment, the PMT, we know in this case is 90, and then we know the future value of this bond is 1,000. And then of course you ask the computer to compute the I, and the computer will give you, the calculator will give you what your rate is going to be. Again, that's how you can find Y if you're using a financial calculator. There's so many ways you can do it. What about the required rate of return, not on a bond, but on other securities? For example, on a preferred stock. In my next segment, I'll be looking at how we value preferred stock and how we value common stock. So I'll just show you that the way we value preferred stock is the same way we do with bonds. In other words, we also look at the future benefits of that security, which for a stock, we know that the stock pays dividends. So in other words, then, if we can estimate the dividends of that particular security, then we just discount those cash flows and we add them together, and that will give us the present value or the price of that bond. If we can estimate that dividends to be paid for that security, then we can determine the value of that bond, which is going to be our discussion in our next segment. Here is, I'm just showing you the formula, and therefore the formula, in short, comes to that the value of the preferred stock will be, of course, the dividends paid in time p, divided by, of course, kp, where, of course, the kp represents the required rate of return. So if kp represents the required rate of return, then we can use the formula of determining the value of a preferred stock. We can use that formula to find what KP is. So in that case, then you're going to be given the dividend and you are going to be given the price of the bond. So you take the dividend that's going to be paid out divided by the price of that security, which in this case is the preferred stock. You divide the two, that will give you the required rate of return for that particular preferred stock. And what about if this was a case of common stock? Again, the way we determine the value of common stock, we do the same thing. So what we do, again, we can estimate the future cash flows. In this case, again, common stock pays you dividends. We can determine the dividends, and again, we discount the dividends, and that will give us, again, the present value or the value of that common stock. So if you're looking at the current price of the stock, which is at P naught, then what we need to know is we need to know the dividend that was paid in year one, or what is going to be paid out in year one. If we can know that dividend, then we will take the dividend paid in year one divided by, of course, our required rate of return, and this will give you the price of that bond at the moment currently. But keep in mind, some of these dividends are not going to be the same. So you're going to get an instrument or a common stock that is paying you dividend at a constant growth, which in this case could be a constant growth is G. So if this dividend has a 1% or a 3% growth, so in other words, what you end up getting in year one, it's going to be a different dividend in year two because there's a 1% growth or a 3% growth. In that case, then we use this formula to determine the value of the stock. So we do the D naught into, consider the growth, which in this case is going to be 1 plus G, and the 1 plus G times the D naught, it gives you the dividend that is paid in D1. So dividend paid in year one divided by the R, the quantity of return, minus the growth rate. If the growth rate was 3%, minus 3%, and this will give you the price of the bond today. Remember, to use this formula and for it to work, it means then you can the RS, the required rate of return, must be greater than the growth rate. So if the growth rate is greater than the required rate of return, then this formula is going to give you a negative value here and therefore a negative price, which does not make any sense. So for this to work, we know that then R should not be equal to of course G. In that case, it's going to be 0. So you don't want that to be 0. And 2, you don't want the growth being greater than the required rate of return. Again, this formula will help us in trying to determine the valuation for the stock. But again, our question here is not the value of the stock. Our question is, how do we determine the required rate of return? So it means if you're given the current price of the common stock and you've been given the dividend paid in year 1, and then you've been given the growth rate, then you can find what RS is. So if you just substitute this, right? If we are, so in other words, then to find the required rate of return, you will take the P naught, the current price, times, of course, R S minus G, and this should give you your D1. And therefore, you'll then do, this is the same thing saying that your RS minus G is equal to your D1, dividend paid in year 1, divided by, of course, the return. And this gives you the return on that dividend. But because the dividend has a growth rate, so if there's no growth rate, then your required rate of return should be equal to your D1 divided by the current price of the stock. However, if there is a constant growth on the dividends, then your required rate of return should be equal to your current yield on that stock plus, of course, the growth rate. This will be what you need if there is a growth element or a constant growth for that particular security, which in this case is the common stock. If not, then this formula will represent how to compute the required rate of return. There's also other ways we can find the required rate of return of a stock by, for example, using the security market line equation. So we can use this equation if we know the beta for the security. So if we know the beta for the security and we know that we know the risk premium, and the risk-free rate, then we can use this formula to determine again the required rate of the security. Again, mostly the common one is where there's a constant growth, which is what you're seeing here. But again, just keep in mind there are other models that we can use to determine the required rate of return on a security. So again, go over this information and let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward for the next segment, which is going to cover how we value common stock and how we value preferred stock. To do so, again, we are going to use this formula to value common stock if again there is a constant growth. If there's no constant growth, again, then you just put where there's a G there, you just put 0 there, and that will again make sense. So see you in the next video.